Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's session of our spring series, which is called Timely Insights, Timeless Wisdom, and it's showcasing some of the best of JTS. And we're really so pleased to have Rabbi Mychal Springer teaching us today. Tani will introduce her more formally, but she among many other things, founded our Center for Pastoral Education here at JTS, and that work has had a profound impact on the conservative rabbinate, conservative cantors, all kinds of clergy and lay leaders, both in and outside of the conservative movement of the Jewish community. So really a very broad impact of her amazing work from her full-time period at JTS. Her session today is called Prayer Through the Lens of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Wanted to give a special welcome to anyone who's joining us for the first time today. And as you saw in the confirmation, in the reminder email you received earlier, you can access previous sessions at the session page. And we don't have a sponsor today, but we're grateful for some other sponsors coming up, and we would love to get some additional sponsors. That those generous gifts really make this series possible. So we have 3 sponsorship levels to meet various size pockets, and we're putting information in the chat, and we would love your support. And I will turn it over now to Tani.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to review the format of our session, Rabbi Springer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We'll also have a Q&A period at the end. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. And during the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Rabbi Springer. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly, in complete sentences, and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well. So pleased to introduce Rabbi Mychal Springer, the manager of clinical pastoral education at York-Presbyterian Hospital and an adjunct professor at JTS. Rabbi Springer founded the Center for Pastoral Education at JTS in 2009. Rabbi Springer was the first conservative rabbi to be certified as an educator by the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. Her publications include Sisters in Mourning, Daughters Reflecting on Care, Loss, and Meaning with Dr. Su-Yan Pak. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rabbi Springer.
Thank you, Tani. Thanks for the invitation and for hosting today. And thank you, Rabbi Andelman, for your very kind and generous words. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's nice to see everyone. Some of you I am only now meeting, and some of you I've seen before, and some of you I know quite well. So it's really lovely to be together. Our topic for today is prayer through the lens of cognitive behavioral therapy. And this series is an unusual series. Usually Tani and Rabbi Andelman contact me and they have a theme and they say, how do you want to teach to this theme, which I enjoy. It's always a great opportunity. But this time they said, as you probably know, teach what you most want to teach. So I decided that I want to teach about prayer, probably because prayer is a very important part of my life. And at a certain point in my life was something that I struggled with very much. When I was a child, the prayers flowed very naturally. But the more educated I became, the more ideas I had about God and how God functions in the world, the harder it became to pray, to know what prayer was really about, to know how God engages prayer, and to be able to say something authentically. So by the time I was about a year away from graduating from rabbinical school, I was in a spiritual crisis. And it was hard for me to imagine what I could offer people as a rabbi that would help them in their crises, since I was finding it very hard to organize my own beliefs around a God who would intervene in this world. So a dear mentor of mine, Dr. Sam Klagsbrun, who, alav shalom, he's no longer alive, he died recently. Sam said, go and do clinical pastoral education, which I had never heard of. But Sam was involved with an organization that I went to, at the time it was called the Hospital Chaplaincy, then it became the Healthcare Chaplaincy, and go into the hospital with this kind of training, and you will be able to work on these issues that are so hard for you. So I took Sam's advice. I signed up for a unit of clinical pastoral education at Memorial Sloan Kettering, the cancer hospital here in New York. And I had this idea. I was going to be working as a chaplain intern, and I was somewhat afraid that people were going to ask me to pray for them, or that somehow as a chaplain walking into the room, people would expect that I would pray for them. And I had no idea what my praying for anybody would mean and what form it would take, because I was so used to the prayers that are in our Siddur, in our prayer book, that I had really lost touch with the kavanah side of prayer, just the pouring out of my heart. So I was nervous, to say the least. And in that first period of my training, I encountered many teachers. Many patients became my teachers as I journeyed with them. And they did, in fact, ask me for prayer. And what I loved about the training that I was participating in is that instead of my having to assume a kind of leadership where I would know more than the people I was caring for, I found that it was okay to let the people I was caring for be my teachers, for their wisdom and their faith to guide us. So I want to tell you about two patients who had a particular impact on me. The first was an African-American woman who had a very strong faith and an incredible prayer life. And she was in the hospital for a very long time. So in the beginning, she was always praying from a place of confidence. And the faith that she brought, the confidence that she had, the way that she prayed, opened something up in me. And there's this idea of holy envy. I sort of envied her, the faith that she embodied, and found that by being welcomed into a prayer space with her, I gained access to a side of my own spiritual life that had been dormant or frozen. As she remained in the hospital, she went through a very hard time, and her faith became tested in a way that she held it more loosely and allowed herself the space to turn to God, to ask God to shore her up, to reconnect her with the confidence that she had had in the earlier period of her hospitalization. And I think that one of the things that moved me is that our praying together was part of her feeling shored up. So I came to a different understanding about what I was doing there as a praying person. It wasn't that I had answers. It was that in my being willing to enter into this space together, I offered her something. And there's this New Testament, I don't even know where it comes from, phrase that where two or three are gathered, that's where God is. And that's what I felt in the hospital room with this person and with other people whom I met in the early days of my chaplaincy. Encountering God in that way left me wondering about a whole lot of things, and we're going to talk more about that as we get into the material. But having the questions was much more comforting to me than having shut down all of the questions with answers that were kind of harsh about the irrelevance of human prayer. In the hospital, I discovered the total relevance of human prayer in a way that I desperately needed. So I told you about one patient. There was another patient. She was a Jewish woman. She was young. She was in her 40s. And she had ovarian cancer. And she said to me, her faith life was very different from the first person. She said to me, "Teach me how to pray." Now that was a big challenge for me because, of course, I didn't know how to pray. So I said, "Well, why do you want me to teach you how to pray?" And she felt that it was going to help her, but she didn't know how. And I said, "Well, I don't really know how either," which surprised her a bit. I said, "So if you were going to give it a try, how would you do that? What would that look like?" And she said, "Well, maybe kind of like a diary. I could start, 'Dear God.'" I said, "Okay, let's start, 'Dear God.'" And so she found a way, haltingly at first, and together, language to address God. This patient ended up dying of the ovarian cancer, which many people do. And the time that we spent together in prayer was, in fact, a great comfort to her as she became sicker and recognized that she wouldn't be in this world for that much longer. And once again, I discovered that I didn't actually have to have any answers, but if I was willing to enter into that space of opening our hearts to God, that would have an impact that would make life, whatever was left of life, whatever sliver of life we were holding on to, somewhat better. So I've been very curious about how to think about this. I think part of my initial hesitation was that I didn't want to be using prayer, kind of utilitarian, praying to feel better, if I didn't think it was actually meaningful or real. So the material that I want to present to you today is a particular way of thinking about the meaning of the prayer experience. And I want to bridge the psychological frame of reference with a spiritual, religious understanding of what happens in prayer. And I hope that it will be helpful to you in some form. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So the first quote is from a book that I love called Spirituality, Religion, and Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, a Guide for Clinicians by David Rosmarin. Dr. Rosmarin has another book that has come out recently where he really looks at Jewish sources and their wisdom for psychological well-being. That book's called The Connections Paradigm, and we'll give you access to sources later. So within cognitive behavioral therapy, there are there's the cognitive piece, there's the behavioral piece, and within the cognitive side, there's a way of thinking about how our thoughts interact with our emotions. And one term that is used here by Dr. Rosmarin is emotion regulation. So he writes, for readers unfamiliar with emotion regulation, it is defined as the processes by which individuals influence the emotions they have, when they have them, and how they experience and express these emotions. In more colloquial terms, emotion regulation refers to the strategies one employs to shape one's emotions and the methods one employs to process them. Clinically speaking, emotion regulation can be adaptive or maladaptive. For example, it is now known that experiential avoidance, distraction from or suppression of negative emotions, tends to increase the experience of anxiety and mood symptoms over time, whereas acceptance, allowing oneself to fully experience emotions and sensations without trying to change, control, or avoid them, tends to eventually decrease the experience and impact of such symptoms. In the modern clinical practice of CBT, the term emotion regulation often refers to the use of processes to facilitate understanding and acceptance of negative emotions when one is distressed. Okay, so when we're distressed, instead of just sinking into our distress, we can work with the emotions that we're having, and coming to understand them and accept them often leads us to be less distressed. So we have quite a lot of input into how our emotions are regulated by us. And that's a basic idea for cognitive behavioral therapy. So one form of emotion regulation is called attention deployment. So what's attention deployment? Efforts to modify internal attentional focus without making further changes to external environmental factors that may affect the experience of emotion. So if we're feeling a certain way, we could change our environment, move someplace different, do something differently. That's not attention deployment. Attention deployment is when we modify something inside of ourselves in order to change the experience of the emotion. So this is a powerful tool that we have. And at the bottom of the page, I have underlined here, distraction and mindfulness are opposite examples of attention deployment that can each be used to facilitate the shifting of attention from or toward emotionally salient aspects of one's environment. So if we want to change what we're feeling, we could distract ourselves, think about something else, do something else. So a great example is if you're feeling sad or anxious and you put on a video of babies laughing, that can be a fantastic distraction that helps your mood to shift because you're encountering something that is so joyful that by distracting you away from whatever was causing you to be sad or anxious, suddenly you feel different feelings. That would be distraction. And mindfulness would be paying attention in a mindful way, sort of slowing down, giving it space, feeling the feeling, allowing it. That's part of the acceptance that was written about earlier. Accepting it, knowing that you can't change it. It's just here. It's like a wave. It comes, it goes. That would be part of mindfulness practice that's part of attention deployment. So, spirituality and religion can have significant relevance to mental health because patients utilize it in the process of regulating emotions. If you think about davening, services, rituals, there's a lot of emotion regulation. We have a mood, we have a certain emotions that come that are connected to the time of year. So we think about the Passover Seder and the way that certain themes arrive, certain feelings come with that. So there are a lot of different aspects of Jewish practice and the rhythm of life impact emotion regulation. And in particular, a very main form of emotion regulation takes place through prayer. So that's obviously our focus today. Spirituality and religion can also influence attention deployment and is often relied upon to shape the experience of emotion by modulating attentional focus without otherwise changing one's environment or internal evaluations or perspectives. So that's what attention deployment is. Perhaps the most common example of spiritual religious-based attention deployment emotion regulation is prayer, which can be defined as an attempt to address or communicate with the divine. Among the aspects of spiritual religious life, there is a particular disparity in the degree to which daily prayer is endorsed by mental health professionals, only 19%, compared to the general population, which is 75%. In order to appreciate the relevant, well, let me stop here for a moment. So when we engage in prayer, and maybe we think of it as communicating with God, there is an attention deployment, so focusing our attention in these prayers in a way that helps shape the emotions that we're having, which means that when we're in distress, it can put us in a more positive mode. And sometimes we might be feeling just fine, but we go to a service that focuses on the difficult themes, and we can think about that today when we might be in shul and we recite the names of the hostages, and that might be a kind of emotion regulation that puts us into a place of sadness that might actually be helpful to us because it gives a location for the sadness that we might feel at other times is just hovering everywhere. But when you can feel it and experience it in the context of a service, it might bring some relief. So that's a little bit about prayer and emotion regulation. And Rosmarin continues. In order to appreciate the relevance of prayer to emotion regulation, practitioners must first recognize that it is a far more dynamic process than many professional psychologists believe to be the case. And given its centrality within spiritual religious systems, a detailed discussion is warranted. Rosmarin really wants to break the barriers between the world of psychology and the world of religion. He studied with Kenneth Pargament, who is a pioneer in spirituality and religious coping. And so Rosmarin's work builds on that. So then Rosmarin says, psychologists need to be much more familiar with prayer, and he breaks down 5 different types of prayer: thanks, praise, conversation, silence, contemplation, and request. Each of these types can have varied effect on attention deployment and the experience of emotion. So what I'm going to do next is take you through the different kinds of prayer. But before I do that, I want to stop and see if we have any questions.
We have a question or two, but I think it might be better for you to continue and with the same way that you've kind of grounded us in the I'm already forgetting the name, the attention redirection or attention deployment. And you've made the link to prayer. If you can do the prayer grounding too, as I'm sure you're about to do, I think that would be great. And then we can go to questions.
Okay. So what comes next is I'm going to take you through the 5 categories. And for each category, I've brought an example. And as I'm working with each prayer, I invite you to pay attention to the emotions that you have as you encounter the prayer. Now, some of you may say these prayers regularly, some of you may not. Part of the way that prayer has accrued so much power in terms of emotion regulation is that when it is a practice and we are really in touch with the theme of the prayer itself, it reminds us of feelings that we may need to be reminded of. That's part of this idea of the emotion regulation, that it's not only that, oh, I'm in the mood for this prayer, but it might be precisely because I'm in a different kind of space that being reminded of, for instance, thanks, which is where we'll begin, can put us in touch with gratitude in a way that can alleviate anxiety and distress. Okay, so you might guess where I'm going to begin with that prayer, with thanks. So the first one is at the bottom of the page. Prayers of thanks can facilitate a shift of attentional focus from burdens to blessings. Right? Kind of amazing. Just by saying thank you, we can shift from feeling the weight of our burdens to feeling gratitude for our blessings. So Judaism gets this. And first thing in the morning, the words out of our mouth, Moda ani lefanecha, melech chai v'kayam, shehechazarta binishmati b'chemla, Rabbi emunatecha. I give thanks to you, living and merciful King, for you have restored my soul with mercy. Great is your faithfulness. When we begin the day with gratitude, we recognize that we shouldn't take it for granted that we woke up, that even waking up itself is a gift. And the language here, shehechazarta binishmati, that you restored my soul to me. In a sense, every sleep is a death, and every waking is a rebirth. So the gratitude that we are alive, the gratitude that we woke up this morning, gets us in touch on just on the most basic level, that being alive is a gift. I know that for me, reciting modality, when I'm in a hard place, helps me to reflect on the good that I have, the good that's in my life, the good that's in the world. I'm just making space here. If this is a practice that you're familiar with, just to reflect on the impact that saying modality has for you. And if it's not a practice that you have, it's really rather simple. And you might choose to try it out and see what happens and see how your day might be shaped a little bit differently by saying this prayer. The second kind of prayer is what Rosmarin calls praise. And what he says is, ritualized praise can thus enhance one's mundane day-to-day experiences by facilitating a selective focus on positive events, both current and historical, and their latent spiritual meaning. So we know that we need to have an accepting attitude towards all of our feelings. And we're going to talk about the more difficult feelings in a moment. But there is something that happens when we focus on the good that we have and offer praise. So it's connected to offering thanks. Thanks is very much the gratitude for what you've given me. Praise is recognizing God's wisdom, the miracle of how God created this world and all that is in it. And so I brought you this prayer that is the prayer that we say when we go to the bathroom, not in the bathroom, but when you leave the bathroom. Because going to the bathroom is actually a very big deal. There's a lot that has to work well in order for us to be able to go to the bathroom. And anyone who's been in the hospital or has experienced the difficulties, digestive difficulties, gastrointestinal difficulties, knows that we cannot take for granted the ways that our bodies work, because down to the very smallest pieces of how our bodies work, they have to be in the right mode in order for us to be free of pain and distress. So, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher yatzar et ha'adam b'chokhmah, uvaravo nekavim nekavim, chalulim chalulim, galui v'yadu lifnei chisech vodecha, she'im yipateach echad mehem, o yisatem echad mehem, אי אפשר להתקיים ולעמוד לפניך, אפילו שעה אחת. ברוך אתה אדוני רופא כל בשר ומפליא לעשות. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who formed Adam with wisdom and created within Adam openings and hollows, every human being. It is obvious and known in the presence of your glorious throne that if one of them were ruptured, or if one of them were blocked, it would be impossible to exist and stand in your presence, even for a short while. Blessed are you, Adonai, who heals all flesh and performs wonders. So part of this mode of praise is knowing that nothing is too small to praise God for, that God has attended to the big things in the world and to the small things in the world. And even if it's a little challenging to know how exactly God attends to everything in the world, being in touch with our being created, what it means to be in a body, and the miracle every day of being able to function bodily, or when we're in pain, knowing that our bodies have functioned and praying that they will function again. And here, just the wisdom that went into creating us as we are shifts our perspective. That's the attentional piece that shifts the feelings that we have, especially when we're in a hard place, accessing that praise. Okay, is that a good place to stop?
Sure. I'll just add that the gratitude prayers have are big for me also. I used to be more focused on modality, and in more recent years I've just found it's like more than I'm able to when I first wake up, it's sort of like more than I can do. But I mean, here's a better way of putting it. I'm not yet ready to sort of like for the paradigm shift that I think it presents. And the blessing that does so much for me is the Modim blessing in the Amidah, and which I think is so in keeping with what you've been going through. I'll put a link in the chat for those who who are less familiar with it, which is probably a lot of people. But there's the piece that I most love about this blessing is where it's thanking God for the miracles that are with us constantly, and like amazing things that God is doing for us at all times, evening, morning, afternoon. It's such a great challenge to me whenever I'm feeling down to say, like, it's like sort of a little like slap in the face, like, pay attention. There's blessing all around you and amazing things happening all the time, which of course there is, just as you were saying with going to the bathroom and all the things that we take for granted, like actually everything that we're able to do at every moment, whatever each of our capabilities, all of the things that make that thing possible. There's so much good in it. So anyway, I'm just
Well,
emoting a little because it speaks
that
so much to me.
I love that. Well, when you say it's a slap in the face, you might think, oh, well, why would you want to slap in the face? But that's the, like, change the perspective. Okay, we're not ignoring that you were in a different place, and this is also true. So if you can get in touch with the thanks or the praise, it gives you a different way of breathing, and that's the emotion regulation piece.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just say also at the encouragement of our teacher and colleague, Rabbi Eliezer Diamond, I've started recently to keep a gratitude journal, and I can't say enough about how much it's changed. Just this kind of semi-regular entries, like how much it's actually changed my frame of mind. So I commend that practice to everyone. Okay, let's get to other people's questions. All right, so one person asked, sort of broadly speaking, when you're going through specific prayers in the Siddur with us in the prayer book, and this person wanted to know, is what you're saying kind of really exclusively relevant to set prayers for which we have the words, as hallowed by tradition, or also improvised prayers?
That's a great question. So when we keep going, I included the Shema Kolenu, which is part of our set liturgy, hear our prayers. But what's unusual about it is that in the middle of the Shema Kolenu, there's a request, actually, that we bring our own prayers. And so it's that nexus of set liturgy and spontaneous prayer. When I started working in the hospital, I had never shared spontaneous prayers with anybody else. In my growing up, I had my own spontaneous prayers, but I never said them out loud, and I never shared them with anybody. And I didn't know that anybody ever could or would. And part of what I've discovered in the hospital is the power of sharing our own prayers with one another in our own language. So in Judaism, we believe that if you have only prayed the set liturgy and you haven't also prayed from your heart, then you haven't prayed. So we need to dig into our own frame of reference, our own language, our own heart, as part of a process of coming towards God. The set liturgy gives us a scaffolding. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to start with these two prayers is that if we find it challenging to access gratitude or praise, we do have prayers that train us and remind us, but we can't stop there. So we're commanded to pray every day, but for Maimonides, any prayer is praying every day, like a prayer that comes to us. So being in touch with what's in our heart as a prayer, that is prayer. That is totally valid and valued from a Jewish perspective.
Thank you.
And one of the things that's hard, especially as people continue to live in this country and have less access to Hebrew, that it can feel like there are increased barriers to Jewish prayer, that if I can't say the prayer in Hebrew, then I haven't prayed. And I really value Hebrew as a spiritual language, and what happens when we have comfort and when Hebrew is ours. And it can't prevent people, not having access to it can't prevent people from coming forward with what's in our hearts. It's a big mistake if we rely on the set prayers and then write ourselves out because they're not home to us. Can I just give you an example?
Sure.
So I had a patient in the hospital who the nights were distressing to her. And she described to me how exhausted she was in the morning because she could never sleep at night. And that was the worst time for her. So as she shared her distress with me, I came up with this idea that I could write out this prayer, Hanoten Le'af Koach, which is part of the morning prayers, who gives the weary strength. And so I wrote it out and I taped it to her bedside table. And I said, when you're tossing and turning at night, you can see this prayer and just put your attention on knowing that God will give you strength. And maybe that's going to help you get through the night. So she did. And actually it was very helpful to her, but I think that it was helpful to her, not because it was the right words, but because Judaism included her concern that sometimes that relationship to the set prayers is, oh, this concern of mine is not too small, is not irrelevant, it's not outside the canon. So it's a way of connecting what's in my heart with what other people have experienced. Other people have experienced that weariness and needing God to revive us in our weariness. And so she was accompanied in the night by this prayer that helped her to hang on. Back to you.
Thank you. There were two questions getting at the same issue in a couple different ways. So I think I'll just read them to you. So the first one says, notes that you haven't yet addressed the question of how to pray when we aren't sure that God exists. This person wrote, I attend shul regularly because I feel a strong historical, cultural, and communal connection, and I feel the value of gratitude. But to whom, to what? What insights can Rabbi Springer offer? So that's that approach to the question, and then sort of just thinking from the chaplaincy side, but really getting at the same issue. Someone else asks, for chaplains, or when with a chaplain, do atheists ask to pray? How would you tell them how to pray?
Great questions. So I began by telling you my own distress that I couldn't answer those questions. And I think part of what happened to me in the hospital is that I didn't have to answer the questions or I didn't only have to answer the questions. I needed to begin practices that made space for God. And as I did that, what I understood about God shifted. So being in the room with the person that I told you about before, the African-American woman who taught me so much about prayer, I could feel God's presence with us. And when I felt God's presence with us, and we could talk about what that means or doesn't mean, then it was easier for me to have room that prayer opened up communication, opened up a channel. And anyone who says, well, I have it all figured out, right? That how? We're in a spiritual realm. Questions are always going to be more poignant than answers. But I found that it was spiritual experience that helped relieve me of the angst of wanting a certain kind of answer. And a text that was really important to me in this process, I didn't bring it today, but I thought about bringing it, but I didn't, is Yehuda Amichai's poem, El Malei Rachamim. So, El Malei Rachamim, God full of mercy, it's a prayer that we say when we are bereaved, when we are remembering people we've lost. And it's designed to be a comforting prayer because we experience God as merciful. But Amichai says, El Malei Rachamim, God full of mercy. Ilmaleha El Malei Rachamim, Hayu Rachamim Ba'olam, V'lo rak bo. If God were not so full of mercy, the mercy would be in this world and not just in God. And there's something about the way that Amichai turns this prayer and on its head and says, you call that comforting? I'm going to come back at you with my anger. And yet it's part of the dialogue. So I'm actually inclined, instead of fully answering this question here, to go on to the next kind of prayer, and then continue answering the question. For an atheist, one question that I sometimes ask is for people to tell me about the God they don't believe in. And often the God they don't believe in is a God that I don't believe in either. And it can open up the possibility of what is sacred to you. Because people who are atheists have sources of meaning and encounter the sacred. And we live in a world where increasingly people who are spiritual but not religious that's the growing population in our country. And we know that there are many people in Shul who would not say that they have a traditional belief, but as the person who wrote this first question articulated, or maybe it was the second one, that there's a connection to community and Judaism and our values. And that person is never rejected or shunned or in any way thought lesser than. I think especially after the Holocaust, which we're all still grappling with, we are allergic to easy answers. So for some of us, it might be easier to have an experience of the divine and say, I feel at home with traditional language. And for some of us, that's just not going to work. But I'm full of gratitude that people still want to be part of this story that is our ancient and evolving story. And I think that these concepts of how prayer helps us are relevant, even if you're not sure where you're directing those prayers. And that was really where I began when in my chaplaincy training, when I allowed myself to participate in these prayers, really not knowing. And I, to this day, have endless love and appreciation for my first educator, Sister Teresa Brophy, who is no longer alive, Alea Shalom, who was from New Zealand and was a Catholic nun, a sister of mercy. And she demonstrated a loving embrace that let me know that there was room for me, even as a chaplain, with the questions that I was bringing. And I feel that I channel her in saying that we can tentatively say what we know, but if we begin with what we experience, that knowing is more grounded. which is why I love being a chaplain. Okay, should we go on?
Yeah, let's go on.
Okay. Oops, I went the wrong way. Okay. The next two forms of prayer, conversational and silence contemplation, involve reflecting on one's inner experiences and meditating on one's relationship with the divine, respectively. While conversation and silence contemplation are similar to each other and distinct from prayers of thanks and praise, these do not inevitably focus on positive events and are also not necessarily uplifting. Right? So the first two would shift us out of a place of distress by focusing on our gratitude, on how wondrous the world is, how wondrous the divine is. These two are a little different. In fact, these two forms of prayer are often used to remain connected to the divine in the context of a spiritual or life struggle. So here's where the tent is very wide. And our example is from the book of Samuel, Shmuel Aleph, Hana. Hana is the person who really invented prayer. So before Hana, prayer was always, or communication with God revolved around sacrifices and ritual. And you'll see in this story that which I imagine many of you have encountered before, it's the Haftarah on Rosh Hashanah. And what Hana does here is simply unknown. And then it becomes known because she had a need for it. So I think of her as the mother of prayer. After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hana rose. The priest Eli was sitting on the seat near the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. In her wretchedness, she prayed to the Lord, weeping all the while. And she made this vow: O Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant and will remember me and not forget your maidservant, and if you will grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head. As she kept on praying before the Lord, Eli watched her mouth. Now Hannah was praying in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Sober up." And Hannah replied, "Oh no, my lord, I am a very unhappy woman. I have drunk no wine or other strong drink, but I have been pouring out my heart to the Lord. Do not take your maidservant for a worthless woman. I have only been speaking all this time out of my great anguish and distress." "Then go in peace," said Eli, "and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She answered, "You are most kind to your handmaid." So the woman left, and she ate and was no longer downcast. So this is an incredible example of conversation where Hannah knows that she can pour out her heart to God and that God will hear her. And Eli, who is the priest who represents institutional religion, gets it wrong. And you could say it's because she's not praying out loud, but you could also say it's because it's not part of the ritual cult. She's doing something different. She's taking her concerns directly to God. And that's exactly what this conversational mode is talking about. The person who asked the question before about, is it okay to have improvised prayers and not just the set prayers? This is our greatest example where she is pouring out her heart. And one of the words that's used here for her distress is kasi, her anger, that even our anger is welcomed by God. There are no emotions that we can't bring to God. And in sharing them with God, something lifts. That's the emotional regulation part, that the experience of being heard. So you might say, but who's listening? How do you know if somebody's listening? Well, we know when we feel heard. And when we don't feel heard, we have plenty of precedent for pouring out our distress about not being heard. And one of the images that we have so often in the Psalms is, don't turn your face from me, the experience of God not listening. So you might say God isn't listening because God isn't there, or God doesn't hear prayer. But I think that the Jewish invitation is to imagine God hearing our prayer and to see what it is like to pour out our hearts to God, as Hana has done. So the second text that I brought is the Shema Kolenu, which I mentioned before, which is, so Rabbi Endelman brought the Modim Lach from the Amidah, and this is the Shema Kolenu, also from the Amidah, our central prayer. Hear our voices. Shema Kolenu Adonai Eloheinu, chus v'rachem aleinu, v'kabel b'rachamim uvratzon et tfilatenu, ki el shomea tfilot v'tachanunim ata, u'milfanecha malkeinu rekam al teshivenu, ki ata shomea tfilat amcha Yisrael b'rachamim, baruch atah Adonai, shomea tfilah. Hear our voice, Adonai our God, spare us and have compassion on us, and accept our prayers compassionately and willingly. For you are Almighty, who hears prayers and supplications. Do not turn us away empty-handed from your presence, our King. And then, at this point, the worshiper may add any private petition and ask God's help. So this is the from your heart part, the incorporating Hana praying from her heart. And you pause here for as long as you need. That's why sometimes we finish the Amidah at different times, because some of us are putting in many more prayers here. Some of us are also zipping through the prayers at different speeds, but some of it is, what is it that we're petitioning for? We have to bring our private petitions here in order to make this ours. For you hear the prayers of your people Israel with compassion. Blessed are you, Adonai, who hears prayers. So I'm just going to pause for a moment here. And there is a tune for this, which I really love, that I thought I would sing to you. And you can just reflect for a moment to yourself about what the experience of being in dialogue with God, either a God you believe in or a God that you don't believe in, but what happens when you open up that dialogue space and room for silence and contemplation. We live in such a busy world where we're inundated with words. So the silence part of it, of the contemplation piece, is really a being in touch between our very most innermost selves and the divine, which can take many forms. And in Judaism, we have a broad array of who we believe God to be. And God has many names. And one of God's names is Shomea Tfilah, who hears our prayers. And sometimes we experience that and we can affirm, yes, God hears our prayers. And sometimes we might not experience it, but we might call out and say, please be a God who hears our prayers. So here's the tune. Shema Koleinu Adonai Eloheinu Chus v'rachem aleinu v'kabel v'rachamim v'rachamim uvratzon Tefilatenu Ki el shomea tefilot v'tachanunim ata. I thought we might pause here before we move on to the request prayer.
Do you know where that melody comes from?
No? Do you?
No, but I want to try to find out.
I started very low because it goes very high if I started my normal register, and I just wasn't sure I'd be able to do that today. So
I hear you.
Better to start low.
All right, we will, someone just asked a similar question. We will see if we can find it afterwards, and we'll add it to the sources online. Okay. So you just touched on this, and I don't know if you want to say more, but there were a couple of questions in terms of not feeling heard, or not, not, so it's not about not believing in God, but it's feeling like God isn't listening, or even doesn't care, perhaps. So one person said, how do you deal with people who feel that, quote, the heavens are like brass? That is, that God seems not to be listening, or even to care. And they shared a specific situation that was troubling them. And then, just to paraphrase a little bit, but someone else just asked more or less, what good is prayer without an answer? Yeah.
Okay. So those are beautiful questions. I love those questions. So a psalm that I've taught in this forum before is Psalm 13, which begins, Ad Ana Hashem, how long, God? Hatishkacheni netzach, will you forget me forever? And these questions, for me, evoke that psalm and many other psalms that talk about God's turning God's face from us. Because when we are in distress and we don't feel that we are receiving a response, then we have the double pain of being in distress and not being met. And what I love about the tradition of the Psalms is that it encourages us to continue to pour out the distress and to acknowledge the experience of not being met, and that too is a faithful response. And in my own life, I think that I lived so long in that place of not feeling met, that space of Psalm 13 was really my spiritual anthem for many, many years. And when I began my chaplaincy journey, I was really in the desert of feeling that there had been no response. And the tradition of prayer, I feel, holds us, is designed to hold us in not receiving a response. So if we choose to keep showing up in Jewish spaces and spiritual spaces, then I think we have to have the utmost respect for someone who doesn't feel they're being responded to. And it's almost like people who feel that they get a response need to be a little quiet. Like, it's nice. It's nice. Their testimony is nice. But the respect has to go for the people who are feeling not responded to, because I believe that God's compassion is for the people who need it the most, who are not feeling that response. And my journey in chaplaincy is about being together with the waiting for the response and the hoping that the response will come, and we don't know when. For some of us, it may never come. But if we have company in the waiting, then I feel that God is present in that company. That when we do Bikur Cholim, when we visit the sick, we're emulating God. And so even if we don't get a response that we would consider a response from God, when human beings meet us in that place, that is an aspect of the divine also meeting us in that place. We may not get the response that we want. And so it can be tempting to give up and say, well, it's not real. Nothing's happening. I get that. So the last text that I'm going to bring, actually, maybe let me read it now as part of my response, and then we'll come back to questions. Hold on. Because I don't want to leave it to the end. So this is a book by Rabbi Naomi Levy, called Seeking the Ability to Pray. Having the desire to pray doesn't necessarily lead to prayer. There are numerous obstacles that prevent us from speaking to God. Distractions from outside combine with resistance from inside, and it is no wonder that prayer rarely comes easily. What helps? Make time for daily reflection. Don't feel inhibited by your lack of eloquence. If no great thought enters your heart, just remember to give thanks for something each day. Don't allow guilt or shame to cause you to hide from God. Search for sources of inspiration, the beauty of nature, the love of your family, your health, your hopes for this world. If no words rise up from you, say a prayer for the ability to pray. So I wanted to jump to that, because when we're not getting a response and we feel like giving up, that idea of praying for the ability to pray, praying for the ability to tolerate the non-response, praying that maybe someday there might be some kind of response that we might recognize, that's enough. And if we stop praying and we do what in my family was always called broiges, which means anger, which means you stop talking to God, that's okay too. Because God always welcomes us back, I believe. I mean, God hasn't said anything, any specific revelation to me that we don't all share. But this idea of tshuva, of turning, we're always welcome to turn. And if it's too painful and we turn away, I see that as being part of the prayer journey as well. You want to do some more questions?
Yeah. I'm just thinking about what you just said. So a few people just quoted, one person quoted their grandmother, someone else quoted someone very wise once said to me that sometimes God's response is simply no, meaning God's listening, God's answering. That doesn't mean that you get what you're asking for. Which if only my 11-year-old could grasp that. You were reminding me of also of something that Heschel wrote in Man Is Not Alone, I think, where he talks about the idea that there are maybe in any given person's life only a few experiences where you feel like there you are, like feeling and connecting to God, speaking to God, God's answering. And how do you sustain faith and pray and all the other times in between those rare moments? And he talks about faith as faithfulness to those rare moments, like kind of remembering that sometimes happens. I don't know, it seemed connected a little to what you were saying, to the Naomi Levy text that you brought. It won't always be there. The prayer won't always be there. The answer won't always be there, but every once in a while it is. And we can sort of keep that as a as a comfort and as a motivation to kind of keep returning to it based on that possibility. I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot. And I think that community, like our community here today, and if we're part of a prayer community, if we're willing to talk about what's actually happening for us in the prayer, that can help sustain us in our dry periods. And normalizing that there are dry periods. But when you think about these 5 types of prayer, so not all the prayers are conversation prayer, or we're about to go on to request prayer. The other kinds of prayer, the thanks and the praise, those can keep us connected to the wonders of the world and the blessings that we have, even if we're not getting responses. Not all kinds of prayer are asking for responses. Some of it is generated by us going out towards God. If we think of prayer only as our asking God to give us something back, then we're not thinking about all the different kinds of prayer. So if we're in a period of feeling that, well, who's receiving this, which is looking for that thing to come back to us, maybe if we focus our practice on just allowing that to be, trying to take some of the pressure off of receiving something back, and saying, my prayer practice is going to be offering that gratitude and just sitting in what comes from me back out into the world, it can make us less distressed about what we do and don't know about the divine.
There were a few questions about prayers for healing, but I think you said you were about to go on to request, which I think sort of falls under that.
Yeah, so let's do that and then we'll come back for more.
Great.
Thanks for all your great questions. Just love that. Okay, so now the last type, the 5th one, is request prayer. It's entirely possible that request prayer, which is an emotional process, may simultaneously provide intermittent distraction from negative emotions while allowing for inhibition through the formation of new psychologically adaptive associations. So that's a mouthful. So intermittent distraction. So while we're praying for what we want, we may feel relief, and it might also tamp down some of the negative things we're feeling and allow the formation of new adaptive associations. So one prayer that happens a lot in the hospital, and that a lot of the medical team gets very nervous about or anxious about, is a prayer for a miracle. When somebody says, I'm praying for a miracle. So in the world of chaplains, we've learned how to understand what this is. Praying for a miracle doesn't always mean the person who's about to die is going to live. That's one kind of miracle. And sometimes that actually does happen. I had an incredible experience when I was a young chaplain of somebody who had an injury and couldn't walk. And the senior chaplain got down on her knees along with this person's family and prayed for the person to be able to walk again. And lo and behold, against everything the doctors thought, this person walked again. So I have witnessed that kind of miracle. But there are other kinds of miracles that people are praying for. And if you're not afraid of what that deep desire is, then the requesting of what you most want that's in your heart, and not worrying about whether you're going to be disappointed, but allowing the request to be articulated, can be a very powerful experience of changing one's whole way of being in the world. So our very famous example of this is Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. Vayitzak Moshe el Adonai lemor, el na refana la. So Moses cried out to God saying, oh God, pray, heal her, referring to his sister Miriam, who had been stricken with scaliness. And this prayer is so elegant. It's just the deep desire. God, heal her. And that was probably my biggest fear starting as a chaplain, that somebody was going to say to me, I'm going to pray to God to heal me. And it's like, does that even happen? But if we understand that healing takes many forms, and the human body and life is so mysterious. I told one of my residents recently that he had to have audacious hope. It's a really sad case. And I challenged him to have audacious hope, allowing ourselves to hope when it seems like nothing is possible. That's the kind of prayer that comes here from Moses, believing in a God who can heal. Now, some of us say, well, let's make that more rational. Certain kinds of healing are possible, certain kinds of healing are not possible. We know a lot about tempering when healing of the body is not so likely. But our prayer for healing is refuat hanefesh refuat haguf, the prayer for the healing of the soul and the healing of the body. And when we broaden it in that way, we know that even when the body cannot heal, or not in the ways that we want, there can be a healing of the soul. And so that prayer for healing is never inappropriate. And then finally, the way that God responds. V'amar Rabbi Elazar, miyom shecharav beit hamikdash nin'alu sha'arei tefillah, shenemar gam ki etzak v'ashaveh satam tefilati. On the subject of prayer, Rabbi Elazar also said, since the day the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer were locked, and the prayer is not accepted as it once was. As it is said in lamentation of the temple's destruction, though I plead and call out, he shuts out my prayer, from the book of Lamentations. Ve'af al pi shesharei tefillah ninalu, sharei dim'ah lo ninalu, shene'amar shim'at tefillati Adonai, v'shavati ahazina, el dimati al techerash. V'shavati ahazina el dimati al techerash. Yet despite the fact that the gates of prayer were locked with the destruction of the temple, the gates of tears were not locked, and one who cries before God may rest assured that your prayers will be answered. As it is stated, hear my prayer, God, and give ear to my pleading. Keep not silence at my tears. So we've already had some questions about, does God really hear our prayers? And I love ending with this source, because sometimes our prayers take the form of words. Sometimes our prayers take the form of cries, both tears and shouts. And this Talmudic promise that God will always open the gates for our tears. And sometimes those are the tears of not being responded to, that always has a particular way. We know all those Hasidic stories about the tears opening the gates to heaven. This source is totally in line with that when we need to feel connected to God most, our tradition promises us that there is a way. We may not feel it. We may live with a sense of God not responding to us, but there is always that possibility that we might feel a little bit of that opening that's just waiting for us. I can tell you that in my darkest times, I didn't feel those openings, and it was really hard to imagine becoming a rabbi and being afraid that people would come to me and say, well, how do I connect with God? How do I feel that God has heard my prayers? And I would have to say, well, I'm in the same boat as you. And if I were in the same boat still, I would tell you that. But my own experience is that really pouring out my heart, really being honest about when I didn't feel the gates opening, helped me to experience those gates opening. Doesn't happen all the time, But as Rabbi Endelman was saying, it happens enough that I can hold on to it. I witness it in the direst circumstances. I witness it in my own life when I've needed it. I know that sometimes it hasn't come when I've needed it. But that desert, for me, has not lasted forever. And I pray that for those of you who are experiencing that desert yourselves, that you have some oasis, at least some of the time.
Thank you. All right. More questions? Okay. So one person wrote this. Does Judaism have the concept that prayers of healing can be telepathic from the person praying to the person who is sick? And I'll just add that kind of a completely unique prayer experience in my life. I don't know if I've mentioned it in this space before, but I had a friend who was the victim of a terrible, terrible stabbing attack about 20 years ago, and survived. I mean, like really miraculously. He was stabbed dozens of times, and he was in Israel. I was here in the U.S., and I felt like, I don't know, it makes me think almost of like a superhero comic where there's this like smudge of light kind of after the hero is like zipping through space and time. I felt like I was channeling something like so much bigger than me, supernatural, like sending it to the other side of the globe. And so I was going to ask you the same question, but this person put it much more succinctly. Like I felt like something very real was happening there in a way that I don't know if I've ever felt quite like that before.
I pray on behalf of a lot of people. And sometimes we're together and sometimes we're not. And I certainly believe that these prayers are a form of communication that can be received. They participate in a healing. I tend to be modest about what I would say about that because there's so much that we don't know. But the experience that you're describing, Rabbi Endelman, is really powerful. And the thing about belief is that I'd rather be on the side of saying yes.
All right, I'll take it. Okay, so I'm just trying to choose in our remaining time. All right, so someone just wrote as follows. So going back to the beginning of the talk, does this mean that the real purpose of prayer is to make us feel better only? I'm taking that to mean, right, if we aren't clear on being answered, but it's, we were just talking a few minutes ago about you were talking about prayer that sort of kept you going even when you weren't hearing an answer, that kind of situation. I guess it's sort of maybe a reductive way of putting it, but is prayer sort of smaller than if it's just, it's just about making me feel better, as opposed to having some kind of effect beyond us. And I, taking into account what you just said, that let's assume yes, but am I being clear enough with the question?
Yeah, so I think of prayer as a lifeline. And It is an intrinsic way of relating to the world and the divine that puts us in touch with what's most important and sustains us when we're in our greatest distress. So, do I believe that God cares about our prayers? It's a very anthropomorphic way of talking about God. Our tradition certainly believes that God cares about our prayers. I feel that prayer makes it possible for us to be connected to the source of the universe, and that as Jews, we have a particular relationship to God that is both individual and communal, and our prayers are both individual and communal. What I find interesting about the CBT notion of this emotion regulation is that different kinds of prayer accompany us and enable us to live our lives. From a CBT perspective, Dr. Rosmarin says that he's not weighing in on whether or not there's a God, but the prayer itself is an effective part of being a human being. That he's an Orthodox Jew and an observant Jew who believes, but he wants the world of psychology to understand how important prayer is for well-being. So I think that as Jews, we often have trouble embracing belief. Some of us don't, but some of us do. And what I like about thinking about prayer through this lens is that it invites us to value prayer practices without having the self-consciousness of needing to speak very theoretically about what prayer is in terms of God's answering it or not. And yet the prayers participate in a world where I hope and trust that the divine aligns with us as we engage in prayer.
Thank you. This is sort of a big question to throw at you with 2 minutes left, but I wanted to honor the fact that this person asked it. And it came from a while back. They were asking about if one has a terminal disease with a known length of time to live, and specifically, what sort of prayer should one turn to in that situation? And this was back when we were talking about, spontaneous versus statutory prayers. I think the question was, should someone in such a situation still turn to the daily and Shabbat, the regular liturgy, or what's sort of the resource and the orientation for someone in that situation?
Well, I want to honor that facing our own death is extraordinarily difficult. Even if we feel we've lived a long time, knowing that this life is coming to an end. My response would be whatever prayer feels possible is the right prayer. That nobody else can tell you what your prayer ought to be. But you need to, if the language of the tradition opens something up for you and you feel accompanied, then that's beautiful. And if the language of your heart is the cry or maybe the gratitude that you want to express for the blessings you've had in your life, then that would be the right prayer.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Springer. Your teaching always speaks so directly to the experiences that so many people are dealing with, despite all of the variation in our personal experiences. You somehow just really speak directly to so many and connect the tradition and your interpretation of the tradition to our experiences. And part of that is your commitment to sharing personally as well. So I want to thank you for all of that and just giving voice to what other people have said, including thanking you for including your personal journey as part of your teaching. It's always a privilege to learn with you, and we're so glad for all of the people who have the benefit of your spiritual counsel and support in the hospital setting.
Thank you.
If you want more of this, a different take, but related, we hope you will join us next week. Dr. Amy Kalmanowski will be teaching next week. Her session is called Awaiting the Good Hour, Hope in the Bible as a Resource for Religious Life. So it's a different session, yet kind of, again, mining our core texts for the spiritual resources that they provide. So hope to see many of you next week, and thank you for all of your wonderful questions. And thank you once again to Rabbi Springer for teaching us today.
Thank you, Rabbi Endelman. Thanks, everybody.